Ordinary vehicles turned into killing machines in less than a day. Not tanks, not armored vehicles, just cars you would ignore on the street. And yet, on certain battlefields, those same cars didn't just move people anymore. They moved fire. And the strangest part? Nobody planned it. It just started happening. But to understand how something that simple became something so dangerous, you have to understand what war does when it runs out of time. Because war doesn't wait for perfect weapons. It takes whatever is there and makes it work. Even if it was never meant to. Even if it was never designed to. Even if it was never safe. And what happened next changed modern conflict forever. It begins with something almost invisible. A broken supply line. A convoy that doesn't arrive. A battlefield stretching further than the machines designed to support it. And suddenly, armies are forced into a brutal reality. There is no waiting for equipment. There is only what can move right now. And that is where the first shift happens. Someone looks at a civilian truck, just a transport vehicle, nothing special, and asks a dangerous question. What if this doesn't carry supplies anymore? What if it carries something else? Something heavier, something louder, something that answers back. And once that question is asked, the transformation begins. Not in factories, not in design rooms, but in garages, fields, and makeshift workshops. And this is where things start to spiral. At first, it's small changes. A metal plate welded onto a door. Sandbags stacked inside the bed. A mounted gun where there was once cargo. Nothing looks official. Nothing looks permanent. But here's the twist. It doesn't need to be. Because in war, temporary often becomes standard faster than doctrine can react. And within hours, sometimes less, the vehicle is no longer a vehicle. It becomes a platform. A moving decision. A threat on wheels. But nobody calls it that yet. Not until it starts firing. There is a moment every conflict eventually reaches, when improvisation stops being rare and becomes necessary. And once that line is crossed, everything accelerates. Because one side does it, then the other is forced to respond. And suddenly, the battlefield is no longer defined by tanks or infantry. It is defined by whatever can be modified the fastest. And that is where things get unpredictable. Because unlike traditional weapons, these don't come from factories. They come from urgency. And urgency doesn't follow rules. Then something even more surprising happens. These makeshift vehicles, they work. Not perfectly, not safely, but effectively enough to matter. Fast enough to appear where no one expects. Small enough to disappear after striking. And that creates a problem no military doctrine is ready for. Because how do you fight something that doesn't look like a weapon until it is already firing? That question alone changes everything. And this is where history quietly shifts. In earlier wars, armored vehicles dominated because they could absorb punishment. But now, something else enters the battlefield. Mobility. A civilian pickup can cross terrain a tank avoids. A modified truck can hide in plain sight among traffic. A van can appear harmless until the moment it isn't, and once weapons are mounted on them, the rules stop applying the same way. Because now, power isn't just about armor, it's about movement. And movement is harder to predict than firepower. But the real turning point comes when entire units start forming around these vehicles. Not experiments, not one-offs, but organized groups built entirely around modified civilian machines. Some armed with heavy machine guns, some carrying rocket launchers, some acting as mobile shields for infantry. And suddenly, war gains a new category of force, one that didn't exist in traditional doctrine. A force that is fast, disposable, and everywhere. And this is the part no one expected. They are cheap enough to replace, but dangerous enough to matter. Now imagine this. A battlefield where a $20,000 vehicle can challenge something worth 10 times more. Not because it is stronger, but because it appears faster, strikes faster, leaves faster, and before anyone can respond, it's already gone. That creates something terrifying in military psychology: uncertainty. Because you stop knowing what is civilian and what is not. And once that confusion spreads, every vehicle becomes a question mark. But how does this transformation actually work? Not in engineering terms, but in reality. First, the structure is simplified. Anything unnecessary is removed. Seats, panels, weight that slows movement. Then reinforcement begins. Metal where protection is needed, open space where weapons can be mounted. And finally, integration, not systems like a factory-built machine, but improvisation. Cables, mounts, welded frames, whatever holds long enough to matter. And the result is not elegant, it is functional. And in war, functional is enough. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because once these vehicles prove effective, they don't disappear after the war ends. They evolve, they spread, they become a blueprint, not for official armies, but for irregular forces, insurgents, and decentralized groups. Because the barrier to entry is gone. You don't need a factory. You don't need approval. You only need access to a vehicle and intent. And that is what makes them so difficult to eliminate. Then comes the psychological shift. Because the battlefield no longer feels structured, it feels blended. A convoy might include civilian-looking vehicles. A patrol might pass something that looks harmless. And in that uncertainty, hesitation grows. And hesitation in war is dangerous. Because every second of uncertainty is a window for movement. And these vehicles live inside that window. But the most unsettling evolution happens later. Because over time, the transformation becomes even simpler. It doesn't always require heavy modification anymore. Sometimes it is just concealment. Sometimes it is disguise. Sometimes it is nothing more than timing and positioning. A vehicle blends into civilian flow, then breaks away. And suddenly, the line between combat and normal life starts to dissolve. And that is where the modern battlefield changes completely. Here's the twist most people miss. It was never really about cars becoming weapons. It was about how little it takes for anything mobile to become one. Because once mobility exists, weaponization becomes a question of intent, not design. And that means the danger was never in the machine itself. It was in what humans can do with it. Under pressure. Today, militaries study these transformations closely, not to replicate them, but to understand how quickly modern conflict can shift outside traditional boundaries. Because once a civilian object becomes part of warfare, it is no longer just a tool, it becomes a signal. A warning that the battlefield is no longer confined to uniforms and armor. It has expanded into everything that moves. And so you return to the image again. A normal car. Parked. Silent. Unremarkable. But history has already proven something uncomfortable. In the right conditions, with the right pressure, and the right intent, it is not just a car. It is potential. Waiting. And that raises a question that never fully goes away. If something as ordinary as a vehicle can change its identity so quickly, then what else around us is only one decision away from becoming something entirely different.